Hey, curious minds. Tonight we embark on a journey that's messy, scandalous, and a little bit sweaty. Forget everything you thought you knew about ancient warriors, because tonight we're diving into the tangled, steamy, and sometimes legally problematic world of samurai intimacy. That's right. Japan's fabled warrior class wasn't just about katana, honor, and cherry blossoms. Behind those stoic faces and immaculately folded kimonos was a social and romantic life so intricate that it makes modern dating apps look like caveman tools. Before we get started, make sure you dim the lights, grab your drink of choice, maybe some green tea if you're feeling thematic, and get comfy. If you're new here, consider hitting that subscribe button and ringing that notification bell, because I guarantee no history class ever taught you this side of the samurai. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and what bizarre hour of the night it is. Let's see who's the most nocturnal in our community. All right, let's unsheath this topic carefully and slice right into the heart of what the samurai did when the armor came off. Let's start by cutting through one of the most stubborn myths about the samurai, that they were cold, rigid, and too obsessed with honor to entertain passions of the flesh. That's cute, but completely wrong. The samurai, especially during the Edo period, were deeply immersed in rituals of grooming, appearance, and personal presentation, so much so that entire industries were built around it. If you walked into a samurai household in the 17th century, you'd find not just weapons polished to a mirror shine, but also combs, scented oils, specialized hairpins, and even tiny silver toothpicks designed not just for hygiene, but for sheer visual flair. A samurai with unkempt hair or stained teeth wasn't just neglecting himself, he was dishonoring his social class. This obsession wasn't vanity, it was visibility. Appearance was proof of status, discipline, and wealth. A disheveled samurai might as well wear a sign that read, "I'm broke, careless, and probably one duel away from death." In fact, grooming was so essential that samurai schools of etiquette taught not only the art of the sword, but also how to carry oneself, how to stand, how to walk, and even how to tilt your head just so when greeting a superior or potential romantic interest. And make no mistake, those little gestures carried big romantic weight. See, in a world where most professions kept people covered in dust, fish guts, or rice husks, the samurai had the luxury of silk robes, lacquered shoes, and perfumed sleeves. That's right. They perfumed the sleeves of their garments because the motion of bowing would waft the scent toward the other person, leaving an olfactory impression. Imagine dating someone today and your handshake literally smells like sandalwood and wealth. The effect? Magnetic, particularly in cities like Edo, modern-day Tokyo, where proximity between classes was closer than you'd think. The allure of a well-groomed, disciplined, and fragrant warrior was often too potent to resist, and the samurai knew it. This wasn't accidental, it was strategy. But let's not romanticize this too much. Beneath the layers of incense and etiquette, there was a stark social reality. Who you could love, how you could love them, and what that love looked like was dictated less by personal desire and more by societal rules, clan politics, and of course, the ever-looming specter of honor. To understand the samurai's romantic entanglements, you first need to grasp the concept of the family system. The family or household wasn't just your immediate kin, it was an institution almost like a small company. The head of the family, often a male, was less a dad and more a CEO. His job? Ensure the family name endured, prospered, and remained scandal-free. Love, in the Western sense, was a distant priority. Marriages were negotiated deals, carefully calibrated to balance political alliances, financial gain, and social standing. Let's paint a picture. You're a middle-ranking samurai around 32 years old. You've proven yourself in service to your lord, earned a modest estate, and have begun to collect a respectable number of poems in your calligraphy collection. It's time to marry. Not because of yearning glances across the dojo, but because your family needs the political clout that comes with merging bloodlines with another samurai house. So your father, or perhaps your senior uncle, initiates the discussions with another family of appropriate rank, over sake and formal gifts, They discuss not the beauty or personality of the potential bride, but the land holdings, debts, and any skeletons in the family closet. The woman in question? She might be 20, possibly younger, and though her consent is formally sought, the weight of her family's expectations presses hard on that decision. Refusing such a match could alienate her from her clan, limiting her future prospects drastically. But here's the twist. Even within this rigid system, women wielded subtle but significant power. A wife could manage the household finances, command servants, and influence her husband's decisions through wit, strategy, and occasionally, sheer patience. But what about romance? Was there space for it in such transactional unions? The answer is, occasionally. While many marriages remained cold alliances, some blossomed into genuine partnerships, built on mutual respect and shared intellectual pursuits. Poetry, especially the art of the waka, was a common medium for expressing private emotions that couldn't be voiced directly. A husband might write a poem comparing his wife's grace to the fleeting beauty of plum blossoms after a frost. A wife, in turn, might pen a verse lamenting the cold distance of winter nights when her husband was away serving his lord. These weren't just literary exercises, they were coded communications, rich in metaphor, where a misplaced syllable could imply longing, resentment, or desire. But of course, not every samurai was content with a diplomatic marriage and silent poetry. Extramarital affairs existed, discreetly. For men, visiting the yujo or courtesans in the pleasure districts was an accepted, if not openly discussed, part of life. These courtesans weren't merely sex workers. Many were highly educated, skilled in music, dance, and conversation, providing companionship that was often more emotionally fulfilling than an arranged marriage. Now you might think, what about the women? Were they condemned to silent suffering? Not entirely. Some samurai women took discreet lovers, often trusted family retainers or lower-ranked warriors. But such dalliances were dangerous. If discovered, a woman faced public disgrace, exile, or even forced suicide. The lover? A death sentence without question. So secrecy was paramount, and so was the complicity of household servants who sometimes became the quiet protectors of forbidden love affairs, ensuring messages, trinkets, and rendezvous were hidden from prying eyes. But not all relationships were purely heterosexual. The samurai class had a complex relationship with same-sex bonds, especially between elder warriors and younger apprentices, known as wakashudo, or the way of the youth. Far from being merely sexual, these relationships were idealized as fostering discipline, loyalty, and mentorship. Of course, they were still tangled in power dynamics, and not every participant entered willingly. But the cultural framing was such that love and desire between men could coexist with martial valor, without social ruin, provided, of course, that the older partner maintained the dominant role. Here's where it gets particularly fascinating. While male same-sex relations were acknowledged, sometimes even praised in warrior literature, female same-sex relationships were barely recorded, not because they didn't exist, but because they posed no threat to the patriarchal structure. Two women could share deep emotional and possibly physical connections, and as long as it didn't disrupt the household or threaten male authority, it was largely ignored or quietly tolerated. Still, the samurai's obsession with maintaining appearances meant that any public hint of impropriety could be catastrophic. Gossip wasn't just idle chatter, it was a social weapon. If someone spread rumors questioning your masculinity, your household's discipline, or your fidelity, it could spiral into formal accusations, loss of rank, or in extreme cases, ritual suicide to cleanse the stain on your honor. To combat this, samurai developed elaborate social dances, not literal dances, but conversational maneuvers, coded language, and an almost performative aloofness to deflect suspicion. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, especially since most samurai homes were not grand castles, but modest wooden dwellings where servants, relatives, and nosy neighbors were always within earshot. Imagine navigating a secret love affair when your walls are made of paper, literally. That's what shoji screens are. Beautiful, delicate, and utterly useless for soundproofing. So lovers communicated in whispers, notes hidden in scrolls, or even through strategically composed poetry left on a writing desk, pretending to be mere drafts or practice sheets. But love, or at least desire, found a way. The human heart is notoriously stubborn that way. Now, if the samurai were meticulous in grooming, calculated in marriage, and dangerously discreet in their affairs, you might wonder, what about the end of relationships? Surely in a world so obsessed with honor and duty, divorce would be impossible, right? Well, not quite. In fact, the samurai had a surprisingly pragmatic approach to dissolving marriages, though as with everything in their world, it came with ceremonial gravitas and rigid expectations. Ending a marriage wasn't a casual decision. It was a statement about one's competence, dignity, and sometimes political maneuvering. A samurai man could issue a mikudari-han, which was essentially a written notice of divorce. This wasn't some complicated document requiring endless court deliberations. It was, more often than not, a single piece of paper handed to the wife, declaring the marriage terminated. She was then expected to return to her family along with her dowry and any personal possessions. Cold? Absolutely. Efficient? Without a doubt. But this process wasn't entirely one-sided. Women, too, had avenues, albeit narrower ones, to dissolve a union, especially if the husband was abusive, neglectful, or failed in his duties to provide for the household. A woman could appeal to her family, and with sufficient support and social leverage, force a separation that carried weight within their community. Of course, such paths were perilous and heavily dependent on the family's influence and the woman's own reputation. Yet what's fascinating is that divorce didn't carry the same social stigma we see in certain modern societies. In fact, some samurai married and divorced multiple times over their lives, each union serving different political or financial purposes. Marriage, in many ways, was a strategy game, with alliances shifting like tectonic plates beneath the seemingly serene surface of Japanese society. But beyond the paperwork and the politics, there were rituals of seduction that revealed just how layered samurai relationships could be. Courtship, when it was allowed to bloom beyond family arrangements, was an art form in itself. Seduction wasn't about grand gestures or flamboyant declarations. It was about subtlety, control, and a mastery of social cues. A well-placed compliment about a woman's calligraphy, an admiring comment on her knowledge of incense ceremonies, or even the deliberate exchange of haiku could ignite romantic sparks. For a samurai, being too forward was a sign of poor breeding. Restraint, patience, and intellectual engagement were the currencies of attraction. One favored form of flirtation was the kodo, the way of incense. This wasn't just lighting a stick of incense and calling it a day. Participants would gather to experience and judge the qualities of different incense blends, engaging in guessing games that subtly revealed taste, intelligence, and cultural refinement. Hidden in these sessions was a coded dance of desire, the shared experience of scent as a metaphor for fleeting beauty and impermanence, much like a romance that might blossom briefly, yet leave a lasting impression. Think of it as speed dating, but every round is a poetry competition judged by how your soul reacts to the smell of burnt agarwood. However, despite these sophisticated games, gender roles remained firmly entrenched. Men were expected to lead, not just in romance but in life, battle, and household decision-making. Women were to embody grace, subtlety, and quiet strength, though history tells us that many defied these limitations spectacularly. Some samurai women trained in martial arts themselves, particularly in naginata, the art of wielding a polearm, not only for self-defense, but to protect their households in times of war. These warrior women, called onna bugeisha, weren't just anomalies. They were respected defenders of their family's honor, a living testament that strength and femininity were not mutually exclusive. In the shadowy corners of romance, though, these women had their own ways of asserting agency. While official records rarely highlight their personal affairs, anecdotal evidence from regional histories suggests that some onna bugeisha engaged in romances with fellow warriors, often those who respected their combat prowess and mental fortitude. It wasn't unheard of for a female warrior to choose a lover based on his martial skill, rather than his family's wealth or connections, a subtle rebellion against the restrictive norms of matchmaking. Yet for every bold onna bugeisha, there were countless women trapped in silent endurance, navigating a world where their worth was tied to chastity, obedience, and the production of heirs. The contradiction of samurai culture lies in this duality, a society capable of producing fierce female fighters, yet still ensnared by rigid patriarchal values. But love, in all its forms, continued to flourish beneath these constraints, often finding unlikely pathways through poetry, clandestine meetings, and shared artistic pursuits. Then there's the matter of scandal, because no rigid system is immune to chaos when human desire is involved. Affairs between high-ranking samurai and lower-class individuals, especially actors from the kabuki theater or geishas from the entertainment districts, were both common and perilous. These liaisons risked public disgrace not because of the affair itself, but because of the class transgression it represented. Imagine a respected samurai general sneaking away to rendezvous with a kabuki performer, a profession considered scandalously beneath the warrior class. If discovered, the consequences could range from demotion to forced retirement, or worse, ordered seppuku, ritual suicide, to cleanse the dishonor. Such stories weren't just whispers in the night. They became the stuff of urban legend, cautionary tales passed around tea houses and told in hushed tones during festivals. Yet ironically, these forbidden romances also fueled art, literature, and performance. The bunraku puppet theater and kabuki plays often dramatized such tales, reflecting a society both condemning and secretly fascinated by the defiance of social boundaries in the name of love. These dramatizations served as both entertainment and veiled critique, offering audiences a safe space to explore taboo desires and question the very structures that governed their lives. Behind every performance was an acknowledgement that even in the most controlled hierarchical societies, the heart refuses to obey. But not all scandal required sexual entanglement. Reputation, as we've seen, was everything, and even a rumor of improper conduct could unravel a samurai's standing. Jealous rivals, spurned lovers, or opportunistic subordinates could weaponize gossip as effectively as any blade. This weaponization of reputation meant that samurai households often operated like tightly monitored courts, with servants acting as both protectors and informants, navigating their own dangerous games of loyalty and betrayal. And what of the servants themselves? Their romantic lives are less documented, but make no mistake, they had them, often entangled with the family dramas they witnessed firsthand. A clever maid or an observant footman might carry secret messages between clandestine lovers, sometimes leveraging this knowledge for favors or protection. In this way, the silent observers of samurai society held invisible threads that could sway outcomes in ways unseen by the official records. Romance, scandal, and desire weren't just personal matters, they were social currencies, manipulated and traded within the labyrinthine networks of status, power, and obligation. And yet, despite the constant threat of exposure, the relentless demands of duty, and the rigid codes of conduct, the human heart persisted, scribbling verses by candlelight, sneaking glances across crowded rooms, and whispering promises behind painted screens. The samurai may have mastered the art of war, but in matters of love, they were as vulnerable, reckless, and audacious as anyone today. And maybe that's the most enduring lesson, that beneath layers of silk, steel, and solemnity, the pulse of desire beats just as loudly, just as stubbornly, across centuries and cultures. Now that we've sliced through the surface of samurai relationships, let's peel back yet another layer of their intricate social fabric, the world of secret codes, silent communications, and the art of discretion that defined their romantic pursuits. You see, in a society where walls were made of paper and footsteps echoed like whispers of betrayal, it was imperative for lovers, whether their passion was sanctioned by marriage or shrouded in scandal, to master the subtle language of courtship that existed beneath the overt formality of samurai life. Communication was rarely direct. It thrived in the realm of innuendo, symbolism, and the quiet elegance of monogatari, or storytelling. A simple exchange of fans, for instance, wasn't merely about the practicality of warding off summer heat. The way a fan was folded, the number of times it was opened and closed in another's presence, or even the choice of decoration on the paper could carry layered meanings. A fan painted with chrysanthemums might signal endurance and patience, whereas one adorned with plum blossoms whispered of fleeting beauty and imminent desire. To the uninitiated, it was mere art. To the savvy, It was a confession dressed in metaphor. Likewise, ink and paper were romantic tools disguised as everyday utilities. A samurai might send a letter written in kana, the cursive, softer script associated with femininity and emotional expression, rather than the more rigid kanji. Such a stylistic choice alone could hint at a tender or romantic inclination, a secret glimpse into the sender's feelings without saying a word explicitly. The paper itself, its texture, scent, and even the way it was folded, transformed it from mere correspondence into a tangible manifestation of sentiment. And if you thought modern mixtapes were creative love tokens, the samurai had their own version in the form of incense packets. Small sachets filled with unique fragrance blends crafted specifically for a beloved, each scent note meant to evoke a memory, an emotion, or a shared experience. When a woman received such a packet, she understood not just the immediate gesture, but the entire narrative the sender was weaving, smoke and scent standing in for touch and speech that propriety forbade. But even within these veiled communications, there was an undercurrent of risk. Samurai society was rigid, but human curiosity was insatiable. Servants, fellow warriors, and even visiting merchants were potential leaks in a fortress of secrecy. Thus, lovers often relied on intermediaries, trusted companions or retired retainers, often elderly women whose perceived harmlessness masked their crucial roles as couriers of affection. These intermediaries were adept at weaving through the social labyrinth, delivering notes, small gifts, or even orchestrating coincidental encounters at temple festivals or cherry blossom viewings, where the crush of crowds and the blur of festivities provided a rare shroud of anonymity. Temples themselves were not just places of worship, but social crossroads. The act of visiting a shrine wasn't purely spiritual. It was also a chance to be seen, to see others, and perhaps to exchange a furtive glance or brush of sleeves that could sustain a yearning heart for months. The layout of temple grounds, with their winding paths, secluded gardens, and dimly lit corridors, made them perfect for both meditation and mischief. A rendezvous at a shrine wasn't merely logistical, it was symbolic, cloaking human desire in the guise of divine witness, as if seeking celestial pardon in advance for mortal indiscretions. And yet, for all these secret avenues, the risk of exposure loomed large, not just in terms of social ruin, but literal death. If an affair was uncovered, especially one involving a high-ranking samurai's wife, the consequences were brutal and swift. The betrayed husband had not just the right, but the obligation to restore his honor, often through bloodshed. In some provinces, the concept of kirisute gomen, the right to strike down a lower-status individual who insulted a samurai's honor, was extended, by interpretation, to acts of infidelity, granting a legalistic shield to acts of lethal vengeance. Thus, passion wasn't just an emotional gamble, it was a mortal one. Every love letter sent, every secret glance exchanged was a defiance of not just social norms, but the very real specter of violence. Yet, as with all human societies, the thrill of forbidden love only sharpened its allure. The stakes made the gestures more poignant, the stolen moments more precious. Lovers crafted entire rituals around brevity, an entire romance compressed into a night beneath wisteria vines, a single haiku exchanged at dawn, a brush of fingers beneath a shared sleeve during a tea ceremony. Brevity wasn't a limitation, it was an art form, a way to crystallize vast oceans of feeling into droplets of time that memory could treasure forever. Interestingly, while men risked physical confrontation and political disgrace, women bore the heavier burden of social condemnation. A man might recover from the scandal of an affair, especially if he was of formidable status or martial reputation, but a woman faced near total erasure, banishment from her household, the shame of her family, and the loss of any prospects for remarriage. The punishment for female desire was not just personal but generational, staining a family's honor for decades. This double standard wasn't unique to the samurai, of course, but it was brutally efficient in their hierarchical world where legacy was everything. Yet not all women accepted this quietly. Some historical records and regional tales recount women who, when faced with exposure, took their own lives with the tanto, a small dagger carried for personal defense and, in extreme cases, for suicide. Others fled, vanishing into the countryside, adopting disguises or seeking refuge in the very pleasure districts where societal outcasts gathered, a tragic inversion of their former status, from respected lady to fugitive lover. Their stories, though often sanitized in official histories, lived on in folk songs, local legends, and whispered anecdotes, narratives of defiance, tragedy, and the indomitable force of desire that refused to be caged by parchment laws and patriarchal decree. Meanwhile, in the shadows of these personal dramas, the institutions of pleasure, the yukaku or licensed pleasure quarters, flourished. Unlike the clandestine liaisons of the elite, these districts operated under official sanction, their existence both a pressure valve for society's rigidities and a theater for romance unbound by marital contract. The courtesans of the yukaku, particularly the high-ranking oiran, were not mere providers of physical pleasure. They were consummate artists, musicians, conversationalists, and poets, educated to engage samurai not just in bed, but in mind and spirit. A visit to an oiran wasn't a simple transaction. It was a complex dance of etiquette, intellectual sparring, and aesthetic appreciation. The oiran herself had the power to refuse clients, a rare autonomy in a patriarchal society, making her acceptance a mark of personal triumph for any suitor. Some samurai formed genuine emotional bonds with these courtesans, relationships that often blurred the lines between patronage and passion. But such attachments carried their own dangers. Excessive involvement with the pleasure quarters could drain a samurai's finances, invite ridicule among peers, and distract from martial duties. A perilous indulgence in a class defined by discipline and restraint. Yet the pull was undeniable, for within the painted walls of the pleasure districts, a samurai could momentarily shed the crushing weight of his social role and simply be a man. Vulnerable, desiring, and desired. The paradox of the samurai's romantic life, then, is one of simultaneous repression and indulgence, discipline and decadence. They mastered the sword, yes, but also the fan, the poem, the whispered confession in a moonlit garden. Their lives were a continuous performance where every gesture, word, and glance carried the weight of honor, or the risk of ruin. As we continue our exploration, we'll delve deeper into how these romantic codes evolved over time, how shifting political landscapes changed the dynamics of marriage and desire, and how the echoes of these ancient entanglements still ripple through modern Japanese culture. But one thing remains clear. The samurai may have fought wars for their lords, but in the realm of the heart, they waged battles just as fierce and far more dangerous. As we deepen our descent into the entangled world of samurai passions, it becomes increasingly clear that these tales of clandestine love, coded messages, and perilous liaisons didn't just stay trapped within the dim corridors of wooden estates or the narrow alleys of pleasure quarters. No, these stories leaked into the very fabric of Japanese art, literature, and collective consciousness, where they were preserved, embellished, and mythologized for generations. In a society where direct speech was often constrained by propriety and the omnipresent threat of dishonor, it was through artistic expression, the poem, the painting, the play, that the rawest human emotions were allowed to breathe, even flourish. And in this respect, the samurai both contributed to and were immortalized within a cultural tapestry that celebrated the contradictions of their existence. Warriors bound by code yet ruled by desire, enforcers of order who danced with chaos behind closed doors. Let us begin with the ukiyo-e, the woodblock prints that captured the so-called floating world, a vibrant, transient space of pleasure, art, and fleeting beauty. While these prints often depicted actors, courtesans, and bustling street scenes, hidden within the layers of ink and paper were subtle nods to the illicit affairs of the elite. A seemingly innocent depiction of a cherry blossom viewing might actually reference a famous love scandal, recognizable to those versed in the visual metaphors of the time. A certain flower species, a pattern on a kimono, or the presence of specific birds like the nightingale, often a symbol of secret longing. The samurai's love life thus became both muse and cautionary tale, woven into the visual culture of a society obsessed with appearances, yet forever entranced by what lay beneath. Equally significant was the world of kabuki theater, a genre that, despite its flamboyance and public appeal, served as a mirror to the intricacies of samurai society. Many kabuki plays were dramatizations of real historical events, often thinly veiled accounts of love affairs gone tragically wrong, or tales of revenge born from romantic betrayal. In these performances, the stage became a sanctuary where the strictures of real life could be defied, where men portrayed both male and female roles with exaggerated grace, and where the themes of honor and passion collided in explosive theatrical fashion. For the audience, many of whom included samurai, merchants, and even visiting foreigners, kabuki was more than entertainment. It was a cathartic release, a chance to witness the emotional wars they fought silently within their own lives. And then there was literature. The ninjobon, or sentimental novels of the Edo period, catered to an audience hungry for tales of love that transcended social boundaries. These works often focused on doomed romances between samurai and commoners, or between courtesans and their tragic patrons, narratives steeped in the tension between personal feeling and societal expectation. Though considered lowbrow by some intellectuals of the time, these stories were immensely popular, reflecting a collective yearning for a world where love could conquer class, duty, and fate. Reading such a novel was itself an act of quiet rebellion, a way for the reader to imagine an existence where the heart, not the hierarchy, dictated the course of one's life. But beyond these cultural productions, the samurai's approach to love and honor left a more subtle, yet enduring imprint on the Japanese psyche. The concept of giri ninjo, the conflict between duty, giri, and human emotion, ninjo, became a central theme not just in literature, but in the moral framework of the society itself. Every samurai, and by extension every citizen under their influence, lived with this tension, the unrelenting pull between what one must do and what one truly desires. This wasn't just philosophical musing, it was a lived reality, where the wrong choice could cost you your family, your status, or your life. Even the architecture of samurai estates reflected this duality. Homes were designed with sliding doors, secret compartments, and layered spaces that allowed for both public presentation and private concealment. A room that by day served as a site for martial instruction could by night host a covert rendezvous, its sparse decorations a deceptive canvas hiding layers of social drama. Privacy was a spatial performance where the walls might be thin, but the choreography of movement and speech maintained the fragile illusion of discretion. Servants knew where to tread lightly, family members understood the unspoken rules of proximity, and even the household pets seemed trained in the art of obliviousness. But time, as ever, is the great disruptor. As the Edo period waned and Japan stumbled into the chaotic transformations of the Meiji Restoration, the samurai class found itself dissolving, its privileges and codes eroded by modernization, industrialization, and Western influence. The romantic ideals they embodied, however, proved more resilient. Even as swords were replaced by suits and political power shifted to bureaucrats, the samurai ethos of restrained emotion, disciplined desire, and concealed vulnerability seeped into the emerging cultural identity of modern Japan. The archetype of the stoic, melancholic man, emotionally distant yet capable of profound feeling, has its roots in this samurai legacy, echoed today in film, anime, and even corporate culture. One can trace the DNA of samurai romance in the very language of modern Japanese relationships. The indirectness, the emphasis on subtle signals over direct confessions, the deep-rooted importance of appearances, all these trace back to the ways in which samurai navigated love amidst the landmines of status and propriety. Even today, it is not uncommon for couples in Japan to maintain a level of formal politeness in public, revealing intimacy only in private spaces or through shared experiences, rather than overt displays of affection. This is not mere conservatism. It is cultural memory, the echo of centuries where love had to be hidden, coded, and carefully managed, lest it disrupt the fragile architecture of social harmony. Yet despite this legacy of restraint, or perhaps because of it, modern Japanese media frequently indulges in narratives of unbridled passion, forbidden love, and tragic romance. From manga and anime to film and drama, the nation's storytellers continue to wrestle with the same giri ninjo tension that plagued the samurai, the eternal struggle between the heart's desires and the world's demands. Whether it's a tale of star-crossed lovers from rival clans or the quiet ache of a salaryman pining for a co-worker he dares not approach, these stories are modern incarnations of an age-old dilemma. Moreover, the rise of subcultures and alternative lifestyles in Japan today, from host clubs where affection is commodified and performed, to online spaces where anonymity allows for the freer expression of desire, can be seen as contemporary echoes of the yukaku and kabuki theaters of old. These are the new floating worlds where the rigid boundaries of daily life are momentarily suspended, and where the dreams, longings, and heartbreaks of the human spirit find refuge. What becomes clear, then, is that the samurai's approach to love, honor, and reputation is not just a relic of the past, but a living current that still shapes the rhythms of Japanese society. It teaches us that love is never just about two individuals. It is about the web of expectations, histories, and unspoken rules that surround them. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals that even in a world governed by duty and discipline, the heart will always find its battleground. Now that we've traced the cultural and artistic imprints left by the samurai's tangled experiences with love and honor, it's time to pivot towards the lives of those historical figures whose personal passions were so vivid, so tumultuous, that they refused to be obscured by time or the cautious hands of official record keepers. These are not just tales of battlefields and political cunning, but stories where the affairs of the heart wove directly into the fabric of power, often with irreversible consequences. To understand how deeply intimacy could shake the pillars of even the mightiest clans, we need only look at the notorious case of Date Masamune, the so-called one-eyed dragon of Oshu. Masamune was a formidable warlord, feared and admired for his military acumen and his piercing gaze, a legacy of smallpox that had claimed one of his eyes in childhood. But beneath the hardened surface of a tactician was a man capable of intense, consuming devotion. His relationship with his lawful wife, Megahaime, is the stuff of both romantic legend and bitter reality. While history presents them as a power couple capable of navigating the turbulent waters of late Sengoku-era Japan, their private lives were marked by jealousy, infidelity, and political entanglements. Masamune's numerous concubines were a source of both pride and scandal, each alliance meticulously crafted not just for pleasure, but for strategic gain. Yet, it was said that his attachment to a particular concubine, rumored to be of Korean descent and noted for her intellect and beauty, stirred not just the ire of his wife, but also the murmurs of his retainers, who feared that his obsession made him vulnerable to manipulation. This wasn't idle gossip. In a world where leaders could be undone not by the blade, but by the bedchamber, a warlord's heart was always a potential point of weakness. Megahaime, far from a passive figure, was known to have confronted Masamune directly, her sharp wit and strategic mind often matching his own. Theirs was not a marriage of quiet endurance, but of vocal, often public clashes that left courtiers and servants in a state of perpetual unease. Yet despite the tension, their bond endured, a testament to the intricate dance of power, affection, and mutual respect that defined so many samurai unions. Another figure worth examining is Oda Nobunaga, the enigmatic and ruthless daimyo who laid much of the groundwork for Japan's unification. Known for his brutal tactics on the battlefield and his disdain for convention, Nobunaga's personal life was equally unconventional. His relationship with his wife, Nohime, remains shrouded in mystery. Some accounts suggest a marriage of political convenience with little affection between them, while others hint at a deeper, more complex connection obscured by the era's chroniclers. Yet, what truly captures the imagination of historians and dramatists alike is Nobunaga's close relationship with Mori Ranmaru, a young page renowned for his beauty, loyalty, and martial prowess. The bond between Nobunaga and Ranmaru was so intense that even in the highly structured and conservative milieu of the samurai, it raised eyebrows. Ranmaru was more than a mere attendant. He was a confidant, a constant presence at Nobunaga's side, and according to some sources, his lover. Their relationship was emblematic of the Wakashudo tradition, the way of the youth, where deep emotional and possibly physical bonds between older men and their younger protégés were both mentorship and intimacy entwined. When Nobunaga met his dramatic end in the infamous Hono-ji incident, where he was betrayed and surrounded by hostile forces, Ranmaru was by his side to the last breath, defending his lord until death claimed them both. The loyalty displayed in that final act became legendary, romanticized as the ultimate proof of devotion that transcended the merely strategic bonds of lord and retainer. Yet beneath the surface, their story speaks volumes about the complexity of samurai masculinity, a landscape where affection between men could coexist with valor, and where the boundaries between love, loyalty, and power were porous and often deliberately blurred. Moving further along the tapestry of historical intrigue, we encounter Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai, another formidable warlord whose romantic entanglements were as meticulously managed as his military campaigns. Shingen's known dalliances with courtesans, particularly one famed performer whose skills in dance and poetry captivated the court, were as politically calculated as they were personal indulgences. It's said that Shingen viewed these liaisons not just as recreational diversions, but as opportunities to extract intelligence, forge informal alliances, and subtly influence rival factions. The courtesan houses were not just brothels, but hotbeds of information exchange where the pillow talk of the powerful could easily become currency in the right hands. Yet even the most calculated heart is vulnerable. Shingen's reputed affection for one such woman, whose identity remains elusive but whose influence was undeniable, is believed by some historians to have clouded his judgment in his later years, leading to decisions that weakened his clan's standing just as the tides of power began to shift irreversibly. But not all stories ended in tragedy or scandal. There were instances where samurai unions, even those born of political necessity, blossomed into genuine partnerships. Hosokawa Grazia, the Christian convert and wife of Hosokawa Tadaoki, stands out as a figure of both personal and historical significance. Grazia, born into a turbulent period of civil wars, navigated her role as a samurai wife with dignity and intellect, her conversion to Christianity adding layers of complexity to her life in a predominantly Buddhist and Shinto society. Her marriage, though initially fraught with the usual trappings of arrangement and duty, reportedly grew into one of mutual admiration and respect. Yet, her fate was emblematic of the era's merciless intertwining of personal and political spheres. When the conflict between Tokugawa Ieyasu and Ishida Mitsunari erupted, Grazia was taken hostage, a pawn in the violent chess game of men vying for power. Refusing to be used as leverage, she chose death over dishonor, commanding a servant to kill her to prevent capture. Her story, both tragic and heroic, became a poignant symbol of integrity, faith, and the quiet strength of women in samurai Japan. These personal histories remind us that behind every grand narrative of conquest and unification, there are shadow stories of love, desire, and loss, human experiences that shaped, for better or worse, the destinies of entire clans and regions. They also challenge the simplistic image of the samurai as cold, unfeeling warriors bound solely by duty. If anything, these stories illustrate that it was precisely because of their emotional entanglements, their vulnerabilities, and their private conflicts that the samurai era was as rich, dynamic, and ultimately human as any other epoch in history. The intersection of personal passion and public duty often created fault lines that could shatter dynasties or, conversely, forge alliances so robust they weathered the most ferocious storms of political upheaval. And yet, as we dissect these stories centuries later, we see their resonance in the modern world, the tension between career ambition and personal relationships, the dangers of emotional vulnerability in leadership, the enduring struggle to reconcile public expectations with private desires. These are not relics of a bygone era, but the perennial challenges of human existence. The samurai, in all their armored splendor and poetic subtlety, simply provide a more dramatic, more fatal canvas upon which these eternal themes are painted. While history often paints the samurai woman in the soft, obedient hues of subservience, a dutiful wife, a silent partner, a caretaker of household affairs, the reality was far more intricate, layered with complexities that historians have only recently begun to fully appreciate. Behind the stoic faces immortalized in woodblock prints and the delicate manners taught in aristocratic schools, many samurai women harbored minds as sharp as the blades their husbands carried to war. They were not simply ornamental figures positioned to enhance a man's prestige. Rather, they were political actors, strategists, educators, and sometimes warriors in their own right, navigating a social framework that demanded cunning, discretion, and a deep understanding of the fragile balance between power and perception. These women were the backbone of the IE, the household unit that formed the core of Japanese feudal society, and through their management of domestic affairs, they indirectly influenced matters of state, economics, and even war. Consider the example of Hojo Masako, often referred to as the nun shogun. Though not strictly a samurai in the traditional sense, her era predates the formal codification of the samurai class. She was instrumental in shaping the political landscape of the Kamakura shogunate in the 12th century. After the death of her husband, Minamoto no Yoritomo, the first shogun of Japan, Masako shaved her head and became a Buddhist nun. But her retreat from the world was only symbolic. From behind monastery walls, she orchestrated power plays, controlled regencies, and ensured that her family maintained influence over the shogunate for generations. Masako's story is an early but potent example of how Japanese women, especially those connected to the warrior elite, could wield significant influence without drawing a sword. Their battleground was the court, the household, and the social networks that bound them. Centuries later, in the thick of the Sengoku period's endless civil strife, women like Tachibana Ginchiyo emerged not only as household leaders, but as military commanders. Ginchiyo inherited leadership of the Tachibana clan at the age of 16, and unlike many of her male counterparts, she combined martial discipline with administrative skill, ensuring her domain remained fortified against internal dissent and external invasion. She trained her female retainers in the use of the naginata, embodying both the role of protector and symbol of resilience. Though her military campaigns were fewer compared to male warlords, her reputation was formidable enough to enter the annals of Japanese history as a woman who could hold her own in a world of men, both on the battlefield and in the political arena. Yet even when they did not physically lead armies, samurai women often served as critical advisors to their husbands and sons. They were the keepers of the family's honor, stewards of wealth, and crucial players in the intricate game of marriage alliances that defined much of the period's politics. It was not uncommon for a mother's counsel to shape a daimyo's decision-making process, particularly in matters involving succession, diplomacy, or the handling of rival clans. Within the household, the okusan, or the principal wife, held dominion over the inner chambers, where servants, concubines, and younger relatives lived under her supervision. This wasn't just domestic administration, it was governance on a microcosmic scale, requiring skills in resource management, human psychology, and social diplomacy. Furthermore, women were the custodians of education within samurai households, ensuring that both sons and daughters were schooled in literacy, etiquette, and cultural arts, such as calligraphy, poetry, and the tea ceremony. This education was not superficial. It was deeply tied to social mobility and the projection of power. A well-educated daughter was a valuable asset in marriage negotiations, while a literate son carried the family's honor, not just in the dojo, but in the halls of political discourse. Through education, women shaped the intellectual and moral frameworks of the next generation of samurai, instilling the values of Bushido, the way of the warrior, but also the subtler arts of persuasion and cultural fluency necessary for navigating Japan's stratified society. In the shadowy corners of espionage and intelligence gathering, women also played pivotal roles. The concept of the kunoichi, or female ninja, while often romanticized and exaggerated in popular culture, has some basis in historical function. Female spies, often disguised as servants, entertainers, or itinerant merchants, could penetrate spaces that male spies could not: the inner chambers of rival estates, the quarters of courtesans, or the private conversations of other women. Through charm, wit, and calculated vulnerability, these women gathered information that could tip the balance in clan rivalries, or even entire military campaigns. While the specifics of their operations remain shrouded in myth, the strategic use of women in intelligence underscores a broader truth: that the domestic sphere was not a passive space, but an active theater of political maneuvering. In the realm of personal relationships, samurai women also navigated a delicate balance between personal desire and familial duty. While societal expectations dictated chastity and obedience, historical records reveal instances of women taking lovers, either out of emotional necessity or political expedience. These affairs, however, carried exponentially higher risks for women than for men. A discovered infidelity could result in forced suicide, disinheritance, or worse, a brutal public execution designed to cleanse the stain of dishonor from the family name. Yet some women dared nonetheless, employing their intelligence, networks, and the complicity of loyal servants to maintain these secret liaisons. The existence of such affairs, however sparse in documentation, reveals a persistent undercurrent of agency, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be entirely shackled by social constraint. Moreover, many samurai women engaged in kaidan, the crafting and telling of ghost stories and supernatural tales, often imbued with moral and emotional truths that reflected their own constrained experiences. These stories, which circulated in both oral and written forms, frequently featured women wronged by society, by lovers, or by fate itself, returning from the dead to exact vengeance or seek justice. While entertaining, these narratives served as cathartic expressions of female frustration and suppressed power, allowing women to voice through fiction the emotions and aspirations denied to them in reality. In this sense, folklore became a form of emotional resistance, a symbolic reclaiming of agency in a world that preferred its women silent and compliant. And even in death, the role of samurai women could reverberate through history. The grave of a prominent onabugeisha, or an influential wife, became not merely a site of mourning, but a locus of cultural memory, where local communities perpetuated their legends through festivals, rituals, and commemorative poetry. These memorials ensured that even if their contributions were downplayed in official records, the impact of these women lived on in the cultural consciousness, inspiring subsequent generations to question and reinterpret the roles that women could play in both the private and public spheres. Thus, the narrative of the samurai woman is far from a tale of passive endurance. It is one of subtle power, strategic acumen, and quiet rebellion. Whether through martial skill, political advisory, domestic governance, education, espionage, or the arts, these women carved out spaces of influence within a rigidly patriarchal society. Their stories complicate the monochrome portrayal of samurai culture as a male-dominated realm of steel and stoicism, revealing instead a world where the soft power of intellect, culture, and emotional intelligence was wielded with precision, and sometimes with devastating effect. As the 19th century dawned and Japan stood on the precipice of seismic transformation, the world of the samurai, with all its rigid codes, hidden passions, and elaborate rituals, began to crumble under the inexorable weight of modernization. The Meiji Restoration, formally ignited in 1868, marked not just the political resurrection of imperial power under Emperor Meiji, but a cultural and social earthquake that shook the very foundations of Japanese identity. The class system that had meticulously defined every citizen's place in the hierarchy, samurai, farmers, artisans, merchants, was systematically dismantled. For the samurai, whose status had been predicated on their martial exclusivity, hereditary privilege, and symbolic role as the moral backbone of society, this was nothing short of existential obliteration. But the decline of the samurai class did not simply erase their presence. Instead, it set in motion a complex reconfiguration of social dynamics, particularly in the realms of love, marriage, and gender expectations, which would echo far into the modern age. With the abolition of the Han system, the feudal domains, and the outlawing of the samurai's right to carry swords in public, thousands of these once feared warriors were thrust into civilian life, often ill-prepared for the demands of a capitalist economy. Many samurai, stripped of their stipends, were forced into bureaucratic roles, academia, or even the nascent industries that Japan eagerly developed to catch up with the West. This sudden shift had profound implications for family structures and romantic relationships. The arranged marriages that once served as political glue binding clans together began to lose their functional necessity. Without fiefs to defend, alliances to secure, or warlords to appease, marriage started, tentatively, to edge closer to personal choice, though the inertia of tradition was slow to yield completely. In this vacuum of crumbling samurai authority, new ideologies about love and marriage emerged, heavily influenced by Western notions of romantic love as an individual's emotional and moral choice, rather than a familial or social obligation. Intellectuals, particularly those aligned with the Bunmei Kaika movement, a campaign for civilization and enlightenment, began to promote the idea that marriage should be founded on mutual affection and respect, a radical departure from the transactional unions of the previous eras. Publications, essays, and serialized novels championed these concepts, inviting the burgeoning middle class to reconsider the place of love within marriage. The once rigid ceremonial negotiations gave way, if slowly, to the idea that personal compatibility might play a legitimate role in selecting a spouse. However, this shift was far from uniform or immediate. The residue of the samurai ethic, that duty superseded desire, that family honor outweighed personal happiness, lingered stubbornly in the social fabric. For many former samurai families trying to maintain a semblance of dignity and relevance in the Meiji period, arranging marriages with other fallen elites became a way to preserve a fading sense of class identity, even as the economic and political privileges that had once undergirded it evaporated. Thus, for a time, love remained a secondary consideration, a delicate bloom cultivated in the shadow of obligation. At the same time, gender roles began to mutate under the twin pressures of modernization and Western influence. The Meiji government actively sought to redefine womanhood through the lens of Ryosei Kenbo, the good wife, wise mother ideology. This state-sponsored vision cast women primarily as the moral bedrock of the family unit, responsible for educating children and supporting their husbands, especially as men ventured into the bureaucratic and industrial workplaces. While on the surface this appeared to elevate the importance of women within the home, it also served to entrench a more formalized domesticity that constrained women's roles to the private sphere, a paradoxical curtailment of the broader agency samurai women had sometimes enjoyed in the pre-Meiji era. In practice, this meant that while men navigated the rapidly shifting landscape of public power, industry, and governance, women were increasingly relegated to roles that, though pivotal, were defined by their proximity to male success. Yet the undercurrents of resistance and redefinition never truly ceased. Some women from former samurai families, now educated in Western literature and ideas thanks to new schooling systems, began to agitate, subtly at first, for expanded rights and educational opportunities. The seeds of Japan's women's rights movements were, in part, sown in the disillusionment of these once privileged women, who, despite their elite lineage, found themselves boxed into narrower definitions of femininity than their warrior ancestors. Culturally, the disbanding of the samurai class also gave rise to new forms of storytelling that grappled with these social transformations. The I-novel, a literary genre that emerged in the early 20th century, was steeped in confessional, introspective narratives that often explored the psychological turmoil of navigating love, identity, and societal expectation in a Japan torn between tradition and modernity. These works, penned by authors wrestling with their own dislocation in a rapidly changing world, resonated with a public equally adrift between the inherited strictures of the past and the seductive, though unsettling freedoms of the present. This literary shift paralleled changes in the visual arts and theater. While kabuki continued to thrive, it increasingly incorporated narratives that reflected contemporary anxieties, stories of former samurai struggling in the new capitalist order, love affairs ruined by economic desperation, or marriages strained by incompatible desires, born from old customs clashing with new ideologies. Meanwhile, new theatrical forms like shingeki, or new drama, borrowed from Western realism to depict ordinary lives with emotional honesty, rejecting the stylized conventions of traditional Japanese performance. In these productions, love was no longer an abstract ceremonial affair, but a visceral, messy, and deeply personal experience, fraught with internal conflict and societal judgment. Despite these cultural evolutions, the ghost of the samurai remained omnipresent, haunting not just the collective imagination, but the interpersonal dynamics of everyday life. Former samurai families often clung to their ancestral codes, subtly informing their interactions, courtship practices, and expectations within marriage. The pride of lineage persisted even in poverty, with tales of destitute ex-samurai who refused to demean themselves with certain professions, clinging instead to their tattered dignity as a last vestige of a bygone era. Interestingly, the notion of giri, or duty, continued to exert its gravitational pull in relationships, even as ninjo, human feeling, gained ground in popular discourse. This enduring dialectic framed the emotional landscape of modern Japan in ways that persist even today, where many still navigate the tension between social obligation and personal happiness in both love and marriage. Thus, as the Meiji era bled into the Taisho and Showa periods, and Japan hurtled through industrialization, imperial ambition, and eventual devastation in World War II, the romantic legacies of the samurai did not vanish but transformed, embedding themselves into the very DNA of modern Japanese culture. The stoic restrained lover, the honor-bound yet emotionally tormented husband, the wife caught between duty and desire. These archetypes, forged in the fires of the samurai's rigid codes, found new life in novels, films, and even post-war family dynamics. What was once the exclusive purview of the warrior elite became democratized, diffused across a society grappling with its own fragmented identity. Love, which had been a privilege managed by power, now became a right to be sought, though never free from the shadows of expectation, reputation, and sacrifice that the samurai had known so well. As Japan emerged from the ashes of World War II, its cities reduced to rubble, its imperial ambitions crushed and its collective identity profoundly shaken, the nation found itself grappling not only with political and economic reconstruction, but with a cultural reckoning of seismic proportions. In this landscape of defeat, loss, and occupation, the symbols of the past, especially the samurai, took on new, almost mythic significance. The samurai, once actual wielders of power and societal enforcers of order and discipline, were resurrected not as historical figures but as cultural archetypes, vessels through which Japan could explore, reinterpret, and sometimes romanticize its fractured relationship with concepts of masculinity, honor, and, crucially, love. The post-war period did not simply revive samurai narratives for nostalgic consumption. It transformed them into psychological frameworks through which the Japanese could process trauma, navigate rapidly changing gender dynamics, and redefine romantic relationships in a society caught between tradition and modernization. Cinema, particularly during Japan's golden age of film in the 1950s and 1960s, became the primary medium through which the samurai were reborn. Directors like Akira Kurosawa, Masaki Kobayashi, and Kenji Mizoguchi crafted complex, often melancholic portrayals of these warriors, framing them not merely as relics of a bygone era, but as tortured souls trapped between giri and ninjo, the eternal conflict between duty and personal emotion. Films like Seven Samurai, Harakiri, and Samurai Rebellion did more than recount historical episodes. They dramatized the personal costs of living under rigid codes of honor, especially when such codes suffocated individual desires and romantic fulfillment. In these narratives, the samurai's sword was less a symbol of power and more a burden, a physical manifestation of social obligation that often led to the suppression or outright destruction of love and happiness. These cinematic depictions resonated deeply with a population that had just witnessed the catastrophic consequences of blind loyalty to authority and nationalistic duty. The older generation, raised in the pre-war ethos of imperial service and sacrifice, saw in the doomed samurai a reflection of their own disillusionment. Meanwhile, the younger post-war generation, navigating the cultural influx of Western individualism and existential questioning, saw in these stories a critique of the stifling expectations that still clung to Japanese society, like an invisible chain. The samurai in these films were no longer just warriors. They were men struggling against the machinery of their own legacies, seeking fleeting moments of human connection in a world that valued obedience over the heart. This cinematic reimagining extended into literature as well, with authors like Yukio Mishima embodying and dramatizing the contradictions of the samurai spirit in the modern age. Mishima, himself a product of post-war disillusionment and a fervent admirer of the Bushido code, infused his novels with characters torn between the allure of traditional masculine ideals and the seductive pull of personal freedom and eroticism. In works like The Temple of the Golden Pavilion and Confessions of a Mask, love is portrayed as both an aspirational ideal and an unattainable curse, a reflection of the profound alienation wrought by Japan's cultural schizophrenia. Mishima's own life, culminating in his ritual suicide modeled after samurai seppuku, blurred the line between art and existence, cementing his role as a modern avatar of the samurai tragedy, a man destroyed by the irreconcilable gap between identity and desire. Meanwhile, popular media, especially manga and later anime, began constructing new visions of samurai-inflected masculinity that blended historical romanticism with contemporary anxieties. Characters like Himura Kenshin from Rurouni Kenshin represented a profound departure from the stoic, emotionally repressed samurai of the past. Kenshin, a former assassin haunted by his violent history, swears never to kill again, embodying a gentler, more compassionate masculinity that still draws from the honor-bound traditions of his predecessors. His love story with Kaoru, though restrained by the conventions of shonen storytelling, reflects a desire to reconcile strength with vulnerability, violence with tenderness, a romantic ideal for a generation seeking balance between the inherited codes of restraint and the modern craving for emotional transparency. This reinterpretation extended beyond fiction into societal norms, subtly influencing contemporary Japanese expectations of gender and relationships. The image of the silent stoic man, capable of great emotional depth yet bound by social propriety, became a pervasive template not just in storytelling but in real-world romantic ideals. Many men, consciously or not, found themselves grappling with these inherited expectations, their worth still measured by their capacity for endurance, sacrifice, and emotional containment, even as women, particularly in the late 20th century, began to push against these archetypes, demanding partners who could articulate feelings, embrace equality, and engage in partnerships built on mutual respect rather than hierarchical roles. The specter of the samurai also informed the salaryman culture that dominated post-war Japan's corporate world. The loyalty of the retainer to his lord was reborn in the employee's dedication to his company, with long hours, personal sacrifice, and deference to authority echoing the feudal hierarchies of the past. In this context, personal desires, including love and family life, were often subordinated to professional duty, an arrangement that mirrored the samurai's eternal struggle between the personal and the public, the heart and the sword. Yet, as Japan entered the late 20th and early 21st centuries, these models began to fracture under the weight of changing demographics, economic stagnation, and evolving social attitudes. The romantic ideals tied to samurai masculinity started to feel increasingly anachronistic to younger generations, who began questioning not just the value of emotional stoicism, but the very institutions, marriage, corporate loyalty, rigid gender roles, that had once justified such sacrifices. Contemporary literature, cinema, and even video games started reflecting this shift, portraying characters who openly rejected the burdens of duty, choosing instead paths of self-discovery, emotional honesty, and unconventional relationships. Films like Departures and Shoplifters, while not about samurai, carry the genetic imprint of that legacy. Characters navigating the ruins of social expectation, forging bonds of love and family in defiance of traditional structures. Similarly, in the digital age, the rise of online dating, social media, and virtual relationships has further destabilized the old codes, creating spaces where anonymity allows for the exploration of identity, free from the watchful eyes of family, company, or state. Yet even now the samurai's shadow persists. In moments of national reflection, during disasters, political crises, or cultural debates, the ideals of honor, endurance, and sacrifice resurface, often framed through the familiar imagery of the lone warrior, the melancholic hero, the unyielding protector. And within this figure still resides the romantic, doomed to wrestle with the eternal question, Can love truly flourish in a world that demands so much of one's soul be given to duty? Thus, the samurai's romantic legacy is not a fossil of history, but a living current, shaping and reshaping Japanese perceptions of masculinity, love, and personal identity. It is a dialogue across centuries, between steel and softness, between the sword and the heart, that continues to inform how Japan, and indeed the world, contemplates what it means to love with honor and to live with desire. As Japan's cultural products began crossing oceans, carried first by literature, then by cinema, and eventually by the sprawling influence of anime, manga, and video games, the Western world became increasingly captivated by the enigmatic figure of the samurai. But this fascination was not simply an appreciation of historical facts. It was a selective adoption of myths, aesthetics, and philosophies, filtered through Western sensibilities, and often stripped of the intricate social, romantic, and psychological contexts that had originally defined the samurai's existence. What emerged in the global imagination was less the nuanced, flawed, emotionally torn warrior of Japanese reality, and more an archetype, the stoic, disciplined, solitary man, whose personal feelings were subordinate to a higher code, whose capacity for love was always tinged with tragedy, sacrifice, and an unreachable ideal. This Western construct of the samurai became a canvas upon which foreign storytellers projected their own cultural anxieties, fantasies, and aspirations, creating a feedback loop that both celebrated and oversimplified Japan's complex heritage. Nowhere was this more evident than in the mid-20th century cinema, where directors like Akira Kurosawa inadvertently shaped Hollywood's understanding of the samurai. Kurosawa's films, heavily influenced by Western filmmaking techniques and Shakespearean drama, found an eager audience abroad. Works like Seven Samurai and Yojimbo were swiftly adapted, repackaged as Westerns, The Magnificent Seven, for instance, embedding the samurai's code of honor into the dusty, lawless landscapes of the American frontier. In this translation, the samurai's intricate balance between giri and ninjo, between societal duty and personal longing, was often flattened into a more digestible morality tale of individual heroism and reluctant leadership. The melancholic, introspective dimensions of the samurai's romantic struggles were either sidelined or reinterpreted through a lens of rugged masculine solitude: the cowboy who cannot settle down, the ronin who walks alone, forever exiled by his own principles. This pattern persisted as the samurai archetype evolved within Western storytelling. The romantic samurai became a symbol of noble sacrifice, a figure doomed to love from afar or to lose love entirely in the pursuit of duty. This motif found echoes in countless Western narratives, from the grizzled war heroes of post-Vietnam cinema to the knight-errant figures in fantasy epics who forsake personal happiness for a greater cause. Yet what was often lost in these adaptations was the original samurai's deeply communal context. The family expectations, the political machinations, the delicate social contracts that made love not just a personal affair, but a public risk. In the Western imagination, the samurai's romance became inherently personal and individualistic, reflecting more the ethos of the Western hero than the social entanglements of feudal Japan. Literature, too, capitalized on this romanticized image. Novels like James Clavell's Shogun introduced Western audiences to a semi-mythologized vision of Japan, where the samurai were not just warriors, but embodiments of exotic wisdom, discipline, and restrained passion. Through the lens of the Western protagonist, these stories often depicted samurai society as a mysterious, morally complex world, where love was dangerous, courtship was an intricate ritual, and honor could either elevate or destroy. While Shogun achieved critical and commercial success, it also reinforced certain Orientalist tropes, framing Japanese culture, and by extension samurai romance, as an alluring but inscrutable system that outsiders could observe but never truly penetrate. As the 20th century progressed, anime and manga began to infiltrate global markets, bringing with them more varied and sometimes more authentic depictions of samurai-inspired characters and stories. Series like Rurouni Kenshin, Samurai Champloo, and Afro Samurai presented warriors grappling with past sins, impossible loves, and shifting codes of conduct, reintroducing the emotional depth that had been largely absent from Western reinterpretations. Yet even these narratives, when consumed abroad, were often appreciated more for their aesthetic, the katanas, the duels, the melancholic music, than for the complex cultural commentaries they embedded about Japan's historical relationship with violence, emotion, and social hierarchy. Video games further entrenched the global appeal of the samurai romantic ideal. Titles like Ghost of Tsushima, developed by a Western studio yet steeped in Japanese history and aesthetics, portrayed a lone samurai navigating the Mongol invasion of Japan. While lauded for its respectful treatment of Japanese culture, it nonetheless framed the samurai's journey through distinctly Western storytelling conventions. The hero's journey, personal revenge, and the struggle between tradition and innovation. Romantic subplots, when present, often followed predictable patterns of unrequited love, sacrifice, and the inevitable prioritization of duty over desire. These portrayals, though compelling, often lacked the messy, everyday entanglements that defined actual samurai relationships. The arranged marriages, the secret affairs, the delicate power plays between households, reducing romance to a backdrop for personal growth rather than a central, destabilizing force. Interestingly, this Western appropriation and reinvention of the samurai's romantic ideals did not go unnoticed in Japan. Some Japanese creators began responding to these external perceptions, crafting narratives that either subverted or critiqued the Western gaze. Directors like Takashi Miike and authors like Haruki Murakami integrated and twisted these imported tropes, presenting characters who might outwardly resemble the Stoic samurai, but who internally wrestled with alienation, absurdity, and emotional incoherence. A direct challenge to the clean moral binaries often imposed by foreign interpretations. Moreover, the global commodification of the samurai mystique contributed to the shaping of international perceptions of Japanese masculinity and romantic behavior. To many outsiders, the image of the Japanese man became entangled with notions of quiet strength, emotional restraint, and a deep, sometimes tragic sense of honor. An image that, while flattering in some respects, also flattened the diversity of Japanese male identity into a narrow, idealized mold. Similarly, Japanese women, within this narrative frame, were often romanticized as demure, loyal, and endlessly patient, echoing the Ryosei Kenbo ideal that had been both celebrated and critiqued within Japan itself. Yet despite these distortions, the persistence of the samurai romantic ideal in global media speaks to its deep narrative power. The image of a love that must be hidden, sacrificed, or forever haunted by duty resonates across cultures, tapping into universal fears and fantasies about the costs of commitment, the burdens of legacy, and the compromises demanded by honor. Whether embodied by a wandering ronin, a world-weary knight, or a modern anti-hero, the echoes of the samurai's romantic struggle continue to shape stories far beyond Japan's shores. In recent years, the conversation around these narratives has grown more reflective, with both Japanese and Western creators engaging more critically with the legacies they inherit and propagate. There is a growing recognition that to truly honor the complexity of the samurai, not just as warriors but as lovers, as family members, as human beings, requires moving beyond the aesthetic to grapple with the intricate social, emotional, and historical forces that shaped them. Only then can we appreciate that beneath the armor, beneath the ritualized gestures and the sharpened blades, lay hearts as conflicted, passionate, and fragile as our own. As Japan marched further into the 21st century, it became increasingly evident that the country's relationship with its samurai past was not merely a matter of historical curiosity, but a living dialogue, constantly reframed in the context of modern life. The vestiges of Bushido, the samurai code of honor, still linger in the nation's collective consciousness, subtly guiding expectations around personal conduct, masculinity, and emotional expression. Yet this inheritance is now constantly in negotiation with the rapid social transformations brought about by globalization, shifting gender dynamics, technological progress, and the unrelenting individualism permeating younger generations. Love, marriage, and the roles of men and women are being renegotiated not in the shadow of ancestral pressure alone, but in the glaring, destabilizing light of modernity. And nowhere is this tension more palpable than in how contemporary Japan grapples with intimacy, commitment, and personal agency in the specter of the samurai's romantic legacy. For modern Japanese men, the image of the stoic, duty-bound samurai remains both an aspirational ideal and a heavy burden. From a young age, boys are socialized into behaviors that emphasize emotional restraint, quiet perseverance, and the silent assumption of responsibility, qualities that are lionized in the corporate world and public life. This gammon, or enduring hardship without complaint, echoes the samurai's disciplined suppression of personal desire in favor of societal duty. Yet in the realm of relationships, this conditioning often creates barriers to vulnerability, openness, and authentic connection. Surveys and sociological studies in Japan have repeatedly indicated that many men struggle to articulate their emotions to romantic partners, caught between the desire to express affection and the deep-seated fear that such openness compromises their perceived strength or maturity. This has contributed in part to a broader social phenomenon often referred to as sakushiaru shinminkan, or the celibacy syndrome, where increasing numbers of young Japanese adults report disinterest in dating, sex, or marriage. While the reasons for this are multifaceted, economic precarity, demanding work schedules, social anxiety, cultural expectations rooted in samurai-esque ideals of masculinity certainly play a role. The pressure to embody emotional fortitude and economic stability before pursuing love often leaves men feeling inadequate or unprepared for romantic engagement, perpetuating cycles of isolation and emotional repression. Conversely, Japanese women today find themselves in a dynamic redefinition of their roles. The rise of the career woman, or Kyaria Uman, has challenged the traditional Ryosai Kenbo ideal of the good wife, wise mother. Women are increasingly prioritizing education, financial independence, and personal fulfillment, reshaping the landscape of relationships in the process. However, this shift is not without friction. The lingering samurai-inflected expectation that men should lead, provide, and protect often clashes with the ambitions of modern women who seek egalitarian partnerships built on mutual respect rather than hierarchical roles. In this evolving terrain, traditional marriage rates in Japan have declined sharply, accompanied by a rising average age of first marriage and an increase in lifelong singlehood. The societal narrative that once framed marriage as both a personal and familial obligation, an echo of the samurai strategic unions, is giving way to a more individualized approach to relationships, where love, compatibility, and personal happiness take precedence over social expectation. Yet this transition is neither smooth nor universally embraced. Older generations, still steeped in the values of post-war reconstruction and familial duty, often express concern or dismay over what they perceive as a decline in commitment, responsibility, and moral seriousness among youth. The ghost of the samurai's dutiful heart lingers, sometimes as an admonition, sometimes as an impossible standard. Pop culture continues to serve as a battleground for these conflicting narratives. Japanese dramas, anime, and literature frequently explore characters who wrestle with inherited expectations around love and duty. In shows like March Comes In Like a Lion, Your Lie in April, and Violet Evergarden, protagonists navigate emotional trauma, societal pressure, and the struggle to express feelings long repressed. These stories often frame emotional expression not as a weakness but as a hard-won strength, a necessary journey of self-acceptance that pushes back against the legacy of stoicism bequeathed by the samurai. At the same time, the romantic ideal of the samurai endures, particularly in niche subcultures and media targeted at women. The popularity of otome games, visual novels, and dating simulators where players engage in romantic storylines with beautifully drawn, emotionally complex male characters, often features samurai-inspired heroes, brooding, noble, fiercely loyal, yet secretly yearning for connection. These digital romances allow for the safe exploration of emotional intimacy that real-life cultural barriers often inhibit, providing a space where the stoic lover can finally be coaxed into tenderness, where love triumphs over honor, even if just in fiction. Meanwhile, contemporary feminist discourse in Japan is increasingly critical of the romanticization of the emotionally unavailable, hyper-responsible male archetype. Writers and activists highlight how these ideals not only constrain men, but also sustain unequal emotional labor in relationships, where women are often expected to be the sole navigators of feelings, communication, and domestic harmony. The push for more equitable emotional partnerships is, in many ways, a direct challenge to the samurai blueprint of masculinity, a call to dismantle the walls of honor and reserve that have, for centuries, kept Japanese men emotionally distant and women emotionally burdened. Interestingly, this national introspection is mirrored in Japan's educational reforms and corporate training programs that now emphasize emotional intelligence, communication skills, and mental health, areas historically neglected under the weight of gammon and stoicism. These initiatives signal a gradual, albeit uneven cultural shift towards redefining strength not as the suppression of emotion, but as the ability to engage with it constructively and compassionately. Yet for all these changes, the allure of the samurai persists, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a symbol of a romanticized past where roles, expectations, and identities seemed clearer, if harsher. In moments of societal uncertainty, particularly amidst economic instability or cultural flux, there is often a reflexive nostalgia for the perceived certainty and discipline of the samurai era, a yearning for a time when love, however constrained, was understood within the framework of duty and destiny. Thus, modern Japan finds itself in a liminal space, a cultural crossroads where the inherited codes of the past collide with the emergent values of the present. Love, in all its messy, unpredictable glory, remains a site of negotiation between these forces. The samurai may no longer walk the earth in their lacquered armor, but their shadows still linger in the unspoken expectations that shape how men and women relate to each other, how feelings are communicated, and how the delicate dance of romance unfolds in a society perpetually balancing the old with the new. As Japan continues to navigate the complexities of its cultural inheritance, particularly the lingering influence of the samurai ethos on modern love and gender expectations, an intriguing phenomenon has begun to unfold. The nation's internal reckonings are no longer confined within its borders, but have started to ripple outward, influencing global dialogues around relationships, emotional health, and the breaking down of traditional gender roles. What was once a distinctly Japanese tension, the balancing act between honor and feeling, between societal duty and personal desire, has found surprising resonance in other parts of the world, particularly in cultures that are themselves wrestling with the consequences of rigid masculinity, inherited social codes, and the evolving nature of intimacy. The samurai, in this broader context, have become not just a historical curiosity or aesthetic muse, but a symbolic framework through which the world can examine the costs of emotional repression, the allure of romantic stoicism, and the universal longing for connection that transcends status, history, or geography. One of the clearest manifestations of this cross-cultural exchange can be seen in the global embrace of Japanese media, especially anime, manga, and cinema, which often carry the emotional fingerprints of the samurai legacy. Characters forged in the mold of the lone warrior, the silent protector, or the brooding anti-hero continue to captivate international audiences, not merely for their martial prowess or stoic exteriors, but for the emotional undercurrents that simmer beneath their composed facades. Stories such as Samurai Champloo, Rurouni Kenshin, Blade of the Immortal, and even more contemporary psychological dramas like Attack on Titan or Demon Slayer are imbued with this duality. The battle between the necessity of violence and the yearning for peace, the suppression of emotion as a form of strength, yet also its undeniable eruption when love, loss, or loyalty is on the line. For Western audiences, especially those in cultures traditionally steeped in their own versions of rigid masculinity, these narratives provide both a mirror and a window, a reflection of their own struggles, and a glimpse into an alternative cultural lens on handling them. This fascination has had a reciprocal effect. As global audiences absorb these Japanese narratives, creators in the West have begun to adopt and adapt similar emotional frameworks in their own storytelling. The influence of samurai-inflected character archetypes is evident in films, literature, and even video games produced outside Japan. The prevalence of the strong, silent type, whose capacity for love is demonstrated not through grand gestures, but through acts of sacrifice, protection, or unspoken loyalty, can be traced back not only to Western tropes, but also to the romantic ideals projected onto the samurai. In genres as varied as noir, superhero fiction, and science fiction, this archetype persists, from Batman's brooding emotional distance to the Mandalorian's stoic care for Grogu, all drawing, whether knowingly or not, from the samurai's intricate dance between duty and desire. However, as these archetypes proliferate, so too does the critique of them. In both Japan and the West, there is a growing awareness that the romanticization of Stoicism, particularly in men, carries significant psychological costs. The global discourse around mental health, emotional intelligence, and the dismantling of toxic masculinity has illuminated the shadow side of the samurai legacy. The ways in which emotional suppression, when idealized, can lead to isolation, depression, and an inability to form meaningful connections. As such, storytellers and cultural commentators have begun to subvert these tropes, offering narratives where the true act of bravery lies not in silence and sacrifice, but in vulnerability and openness. Japan itself is participating in this global conversation. Contemporary Japanese literature, cinema, and even pop music increasingly challenge the old codes. Authors like Sayaka Murata, in her novel Convenience Store Woman, and filmmakers like Hirokazu Koreeda, in films such as Shoplifters and After the Storm, explore characters who defy social expectations, rejecting inherited roles in favor of constructing their own definitions of love, family, and fulfillment. These works resonate with audiences worldwide precisely because they articulate a quiet rebellion against the societal scripts that constrain emotional expression and personal happiness. Scripts that, whether derived from the samurai or from Western chivalric traditions, have dictated what it means to love, to lead, and to live as a man or a woman. Simultaneously, Japan's youth culture is increasingly experimenting with alternative models of gender and romance that eschew the rigidity of past frameworks. The rise of herbivore men, a term used to describe young Japanese men who reject aggressive careerism, traditional courtship, and the hyper-masculine ideals of their predecessors, reflects a conscious distancing from the samurai-inflected model of what it means to be a man. While sometimes criticized domestically as emblematic of societal decline or personal weakness, the herbivore phenomenon can also be seen as a form of cultural evolution, a reshaping of masculinity that prioritizes emotional sensitivity, personal contentment, and a non-combative approach to relationships. Similarly, Japanese women are increasingly embracing both autonomy and emotional directness, seeking partners who can engage as equals rather than as distant, protective figures who communicate affection through implication rather than expression. In the urban centers of Tokyo, Osaka, and beyond, dating cultures have begun to reflect these shifts, with younger couples favoring open communication, shared responsibilities, and emotional transparency, albeit not without generational pushback and the lingering shadows of tradition. Globally, the romanticized samurai continues to fascinate, but the narratives surrounding them are being deconstructed and rebuilt. Western audiences, once content to consume stories of the lone, lovelorn warrior, are now more attuned to the psychological and relational tolls of such isolation. In literature, film, and therapy rooms alike, there is a growing call to dismantle the armor, both literal and metaphorical, that men have historically been encouraged to wear and to explore what lies beneath. The woundedness, the desires, the vulnerabilities that make genuine connection possible. Perhaps this is the samurai legacy's most unexpected evolution, from a symbol of emotional repression and dutiful sacrifice to a cautionary figure, a historical artifact that now prompts reflection on what we lose when we place duty above all else, including love, self-understanding, and emotional health. In this reframing, the samurai is no longer just the armored sentinel standing guard over ancient values, but also the ghost that haunts our ongoing struggle to reconcile strength with softness, discipline with openness, and legacy with the urgent demands of the heart. This global conversation continues to evolve, with creators, thinkers, and ordinary people participating in a sprawling, cross-cultural dialogue about what it means to love and live with integrity in a world where the old codes no longer serve as reliable guides. The samurai's shadow stretches long, but with each story retold, each trope re-examined, and each tradition challenged, we step closer to forging new ways of being, ways that honor not just the discipline of the warrior, but the courage it takes to be fully, vulnerably human. As the image of the samurai continues to evolve within the cultural consciousness of Japan and reverberates across the globe, its influence has extended well beyond the narrow confines of romance or masculinity. The ethical framework, the internal codes, and the stoic dedication to duty associated with the samurai have, over time, seeped into the way leadership is conceptualized, how professional relationships are managed, and even how national and cultural identities are forged and performed on the world stage. Yet even here, the specter of love, not always romantic, but the love of duty, of people, of legacy, is inextricably tied to these broader applications, revealing that intimacy and connection are not solely private matters, but integral components of how societies envision ethical conduct and collective purpose. In modern Japan, for instance, the corporate world has long been imbued with echoes of the samurai ethos. The archetype of the kaishin, or company man, is a direct descendant of the feudal retainer, loyal to his corporate lord, enduring grueling hours without complaint, prepared to subsume personal desires for the good of the organization. This culture of corporate loyalty, often criticized for fostering burnout, emotional suppression, and stifling individual creativity, nonetheless stems from the same Bushido principles that emphasized loyalty, perseverance, and self-sacrifice. And much like the samurai, whose romantic lives were often subordinated to their service and social obligations, many modern Japanese workers have historically placed career advancement and company expectations above personal relationships, sometimes to the detriment of emotional well-being and family life. Yet this paradigm is not static. As societal values shift, there is a growing critique of this corporate samurai model, both within Japan and in the global perception of Japanese work culture. The so-called karoshi, or death by overwork, has sparked national conversations about the cost of equating loyalty with personal annihilation, leading to reforms aimed at fostering better work-life balance and encouraging emotional transparency within professional settings. Younger generations exposed to global discourses on mental health and personal fulfillment are increasingly resistant to the old demands of corporate fealty. They seek workplaces that not only value productivity, but also prioritize employee well-being, interpersonal respect, and ethical leadership, qualities that, interestingly, can be traced back to the less rigid interpretations of Bushido, where a true leader was expected to protect, nurture, and honor not just the code, but the people under their charge. In this reimagining of the samurai's role within leadership, the romantic qualities once confined to private relationships, empathy, compassion, attentiveness, are being integrated into the public and professional sphere. The ideal leader is no longer merely the distant strategist or the unflinching executor of policies, but someone capable of emotional intelligence, who understands that loyalty is earned not through fear or hierarchy, but through mutual respect and genuine human connection. This evolution mirrors the broader societal shift away from seeing love and emotion as antithetical to strength, positioning them instead as essential components of ethical leadership and social cohesion. Culturally, the samurai legacy also continues to inform Japan's national identity, particularly in how the nation presents itself to the world. The meticulous craftsmanship, the dedication to excellence, the understated elegance, all hallmarks of the samurai, are woven into Japan's global brand, influencing everything from automotive engineering to culinary arts to the nuanced politeness of customer service. This cultivated image of discipline and grace, however, is not without its complications. It often glosses over the internal struggles, the psychological tolls, and the complex personal histories that underpin such public displays of perfection. The same can be said of the romantic image of the samurai. Beneath the composed exterior often lay hearts fraught with unspoken desires, forbidden loves, and emotional conflicts that were rarely allowed to surface publicly. Interestingly, this duality, the polished facade masking internal turmoil, has become a recognizable narrative structure in global storytelling. In literature, film, and even political rhetoric, the figure of the leader or hero who sacrifices personal happiness for the greater good, who carries hidden wounds beneath a stoic surface, echoes the romanticized struggles of the samurai. This narrative resonates not only because it dramatizes sacrifice and integrity, but because it reflects a universal human experience. The tension between personal desires and collective expectations, between the need for connection and the fear of vulnerability. Moreover, Japan's cultural exports, from Zen aesthetics to martial arts philosophy, often carry subliminal lessons about these samurai-derived values, which have been enthusiastically adopted and adapted in various cultural contexts worldwide. The principles of Kaizen, continuous improvement, wabi-sabi, embracing imperfection, and kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold, highlighting flaws as part of the object's history, all embody a worldview that finds beauty and meaning in discipline, resilience, and emotional depth. Philosophies that, while not strictly samurai in origin, are often associated with the same cultural milieu that produced the Bushido Code. At the heart of these philosophies is a kind of love, not always romantic, but a profound respect and care for craft, community, and continuity. Whether in the meticulous forging of a katana, the delicate choreography of a tea ceremony, or the quiet attention to detail in modern design, there is an underlying ethic of devotion. This devotion, when refracted through the lens of leadership or societal values, becomes a form of ethical love, a commitment to nurturing what one is entrusted with, be it a relationship, an organization, or a cultural tradition. Yet, Japan itself is increasingly conscious of the need to reinterpret these values for a modern context, where rigid hierarchies and emotional repression no longer align with societal well-being or global ethical standards. The contemporary re-examination of Bushido and samurai ethics is not about discarding the past, but about reconfiguring it, extracting the virtues of discipline, honor, and respect, while shedding the corrosive elements of emotional suppression and blind loyalty. This reconfiguration is evident in modern Japanese discussions around gender roles, where the traditional expectations inherited from the samurai era are being actively challenged. More women are ascending to leadership positions, redefining authority not as command but as collaboration, bringing to bear a relational style of leadership that values empathy and emotional literacy, qualities that were once marginalized in the samurai's masculine ideal. Similarly, men are increasingly encouraged to engage with their emotional lives, to parent with presence, to partner with equality, and to lead with vulnerability. The samurai's romantic legacy in this sense is undergoing a transformation, from a cautionary tale of stifled passion to an evolving blueprint for integrating love of self, others, and community into every facet of life, including the most public arenas of leadership and cultural identity. As Japan continues to reflect on its past while forging its future, the samurai remains an indelible part of its cultural DNA, not as a relic to be nostalgically revered, but as a complex living symbol of the nation's ongoing conversation with itself about what it means to live with honor, to love with integrity, and to lead with both strength and compassion. And as this conversation expands beyond Japan's shores, it offers the world valuable insights into the delicate art of balancing tradition with transformation, discipline with emotion, and duty with desire. As we arrive at the closing chapter of this intricate journey through the tangled histories of samurai intimacy, honor, and emotional discipline, it becomes undeniable that the resonance of their legacy extends far beyond the borders of their time or the shores of Japan. The samurai were not just figures of war, nor were they merely cultural ornaments polished by the passage of history. They were, at their core, human beings entangled in the same enduring struggles that define us today. The longing for connection, the burden of expectation, the conflict between who society asks us to be and who we quietly yearn to become, the armor they wore, the swords they carried, the codes they obeyed. All these were merely external manifestations of deeper, more universal questions about identity, love, and the price of living authentically in a world that demands masks. And even though their era has long since passed, their emotional dilemmas remain stitched into the very fabric of human experience, reverberating through stories, social structures, and personal reflections across the modern world. One of the most profound legacies the samurai leave us with is the understanding that love, whether romantic, filial, or communal, is inextricably linked to vulnerability. For all their legendary strength and stoicism, the samurai lived with a constant undercurrent of impermanence. They trained under the shadow of death, understanding that each moment could be their last. This proximity to mortality did not always breed coldness, rather, it sharpened their capacity to cherish fleeting beauty, to recognize that love, like life itself, is ephemeral and therefore precious. In their poetry, their art, and their carefully composed letters, we find traces of this bittersweet acknowledgement, an awareness that to love is to risk loss, that to connect is to expose oneself to the possibility of sorrow. Yet despite these risks, they loved nonetheless, albeit in ways circumscribed by duty and decorum, often expressing passion through metaphor, gesture, or sacrifice, rather than through the unguarded intimacy we might prize today. This lesson remains strikingly relevant in a modern world saturated with superficial connections, yet starved for genuine intimacy. In an era of instant communication and curated digital personas, the samurai's meticulous approach to relationships, their insistence on depth, sincerity, and honor in connection, offers a poignant counterbalance. Their legacy challenges us to reconsider the quality of our attachments, to ask whether we engage with others out of convenience or out of a sincere commitment to understanding, respect, and care. In a time when love is often commodified and disposable, the samurai remind us that meaningful bonds require effort, discipline, and a willingness to confront discomfort, both within ourselves and in others. Yet, alongside this reverence for connection, the samurai legacy also serves as a cautionary tale. Their emotional restraint, while admirable in its composure, often came at the expense of personal happiness, mental health, and relational fulfillment. The suppression of vulnerability, enshrined as strength, frequently led to isolation, misunderstandings, and unspoken regrets. This duality, of strength masking sorrow, is a thread that runs through countless narratives, both historical and fictional, that depict the samurai not as paragons of emotional mastery, but as deeply flawed, often lonely figures haunted by the connections they could never fully articulate or sustain. And here lies an essential insight for us today: that emotional fortitude need not be built on repression, but can instead arise from the courage to be open, to be seen, and to forge bonds that transcend mere obligation. On a societal level, the samurai's influence continues to shape Japan's collective psyche, particularly in its attitudes towards community, responsibility, and national identity. The ideals of discipline, respect, and harmony still inform social behaviors and professional ethics, yet there is an increasing recognition that these values must evolve to accommodate a more emotionally fluent and inclusive society. Japan's ongoing efforts to address mental health, to foster work-life balance, and to encourage gender equality are part of this broader re-examination of inherited codes, a cultural dialogue that seeks to preserve the best of the past while discarding the emotional constraints that no longer serve the present. Globally, the fascination with the samurai persists, not because of their martial prowess alone, but because they encapsulate a universal human paradox: the tension between the desire to fulfill societal roles and the equally powerful need for personal authenticity. Every culture, in its own way, grapples with this tension: the expectation to conform, to sacrifice, to uphold traditions. Even as individuals seek paths that honor their unique desires, dreams, and emotional truths, the samurai, in all their disciplined elegance and hidden turmoil, embody this struggle, offering a lens through which we can examine our own lives. Whether we wear literal armor or the metaphorical defenses we construct in daily life, we each carry the question: who am I beneath the layers I wear for the world? Who do I become when I allow myself to be fully known? In this light, the samurai's romantic legacy becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes a call to action. It invites us to rethink how we approach love and connection, not as side quests to our personal or professional ambitions, but as integral to our sense of purpose and fulfillment. It urges us to cultivate relationships that are not merely functional, but transformative. Relationships where emotional honesty is not a liability, but a strength. Where vulnerability is not a weakness, but the foundation of trust. In doing so, we can begin to dismantle the old paradigms that equate stoicism with virtue and start building new models of strength rooted in compassion, empathy, and openness. As we close this exploration, perhaps the most enduring lesson the samurai offer us is the importance of balance between duty and desire, between strength and sensitivity, between public identity and private truth. They remind us that while codes and traditions can guide us, it is our capacity to love, to connect, and to be genuinely human that defines the worth of our journey. In a world that often prioritizes speed, productivity, and surface interactions, taking the time to engage deeply, with ourselves, with others, with the histories that shape us, is perhaps the most revolutionary act we can undertake. And now, as we part ways on this journey through history, passion, and philosophy, I want to invite you to carry these reflections forward. If you enjoyed this deep dive, if you learned something new, or if it stirred thoughts about your own life and relationships, consider subscribing to the channel. This community thrives on curiosity, conversation, and the kind of storytelling that doesn't just inform, but transforms. And I'd love to hear from you. What did this story awaken in you? Did you see glimpses of your own struggles in the samurai's battles between heart and duty? Have you ever felt the weight of expectations shaping your approach to love, identity, or personal freedom? Share your stories, your insights, your questions in the comments, because this isn't just a lecture, it's a dialogue, a shared exploration of what it means to live and love with depth and integrity. Thank you for staying with me through this long, winding path. Until next time, keep your mind sharp, your heart open, and remember, even the strongest armor cannot protect what we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves.